They say war never changes, but no one ever tells you it can start over tomatoes. When I first stepped into my new backyard in Sycamore Heights, I felt like I'd finally arrived. It wasn't just a house, it was the dream. Clean, symmetrical streets lined with manicured lawns and cheerful porch swings, the distant hum of sprinklers blending with the occasional bark of a dog. The kind of neighborhood where people wave to each other during their morning walks and holiday lights are synchronized like a suburban symphony. And tucked behind my new home was the crown jewel in my eyes, a modest but sunny little backyard. It wasn't big, but it was mine. A space I could finally turn into the lush garden I'd always wanted. Raised beds, companion planting, composting. These weren't just hobbies. They were passions that had been on hold during years of apartment living and city chaos. This was going to be my sanctuary. I spent weeks researching soil composition, climate-appropriate crops, pest prevention strategies, and the best heirloom seed suppliers across the country. Every bag of soil, every plank for a raised bed, every dripper and timer for the irrigation system was carefully selected and assembled with love, sweat, and a healthy respect for manual labor. I wanted something more than just vegetables. I wanted a living, breathing work of art that tasted as good as it looked. The tomatoes were my pride. Black Krim, Cherokee purple, Brandywine, each with its own unique hue, taste, and texture. Then came the strawberries, a delicate French Marab strain with a wild aroma so intoxicating that even I would pause during watering just to inhale its sweetness. And the peppers. Oh, the peppers. From sweet banana types to fiery ghost and lemon drops, I'd scoured seed forums, traded with enthusiasts, and paid premium prices just to get my hands on the rarest varieties. There was something deeply satisfying about watching things grow, like quiet magic unfolding right in my backyard. I'd leave for work with the sunrise and come home eager to see which leaves had unfurled, which fruits had started to blush, which vines had stretched their fingers just a bit farther than yesterday. It was peace. It was purpose. And for a while, it felt like that little plot of land could heal the jagged edges left by years of stress. But peace, I would soon learn, has a price in Sycamore Heights. And that price was spelled Patricia. Patricia Wilkerson, although most of the neighborhood had quietly rebranded her as Karen, was the self-appointed queen of order. Mid-50s, a helmet of blonde hair so perfectly shaped it could deflect hail, and a wardrobe of pastel pantsuits that seemed to radiate authority. She didn't just enforce HOA rules, she sanctified them. The woman walked with the poise of someone who believed divine purpose had placed her in charge of streetlight wattage and acceptable mailbox paint. For the first year, I managed to fly under her radar. I kept my grass trimmed, my trash bins tucked away, and nodded politely during community meetings. But my mistake, my real sin, was letting my garden thrive. It began with tomatoes. One summer morning, I left for work knowing that my black Krims were a day away from perfection. That deep, smoky red just beginning to form, the skins tightening, the stems bending under their own promise. I even considered skipping the harvest until evening to ensure maximum flavor. But when I came home, they were gone. Not a trace, not a dropped leaf. Just 3 perfectly cut stems where my most beautiful fruit had been. At first, I laughed it off. Maybe a particularly bold squirrel had upgraded its palate. Or a neighborhood kid got curious. I posted a small wooden sign next to the garden beds. Please ask before picking, happy to share. It felt friendly, naive in hindsight. 2 days later, my Marab strawberries disappeared. Not all of them, just the best ones, the ripest, the kind of selective harvest that only someone with experience and intent would pull off. No scattered greens, no half-bitten fruit left behind. Whoever had picked them knew exactly what they were doing. That's when I started to feel it, an itch in the back of my mind. A tension in my chest every time I walked out to my garden, afraid of what might be missing next. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being prepared. A week passed. I was down on one knee inspecting what looked like leaf damage on my cucumber plants. The kind of thing that could be aphids or sabotage. That's when I felt the presence. Before I even saw her shadow. I looked up slowly, and there she was. Patricia, arms folded, chin tilted slightly, in that signature expression of disapproval that made her look like she was perpetually smelling sour milk. Her voice came smooth, too smooth. You know, Christopher, the HOA has guidelines. Vegetable gardens are supposed to be in the backyard, not visible from the street. I blinked. I stood. I gestured around me. Patricia, this is my backyard. She waved a dismissive hand toward the walking path that ran behind our row of homes, as if that somehow counted. They're still visible to people walking by, she insisted, voice honeyed but oozing with something more acidic beneath. I had anticipated this. Section 7, paragraph 3, I recited calmly. Backyard gardens are permitted as long as they're under 30% of the yard and well maintained. I'm under that limit, neatly organized and within regulation. Her lips twitched, as if she'd tasted something bitter. Then came the smile. That tight, insincere, weaponized smile that had probably broken 1,000 neighborhood spirits. Well, your tomatoes are looking lovely. Almost ripe, aren't they? She leaned just enough over the fence to get a closer look. Too close. It wasn't curiosity. It was ownership. Some of them already have been, I said, watching her carefully, and for a fraction of a second, her mask cracked. A flicker of surprise, quickly smoothed away. Oh well, you know, wildlife. Maybe you should consider netting. And with that, she turned, her crisp blue pantsuit snapping with the breeze, leaving me standing there with dirt on my hands and a growing sense that something far uglier than aphids had taken root in my garden. 3 days later, the illusion of peace finally shattered. I came home after a morning off and something felt off the moment I stepped through the gate. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The beds were still tidy, the soil freshly watered, but my pepper plants, particularly the lemon drops I had been watching like a hawk, had been disturbed. A few of the stems hung oddly, bent in places they hadn't been the day before, and the fruit I had been waiting weeks for, had vanished. No overripe peppers fallen to the ground, no nibbles from rabbits or birds. Just clean snips and empty stalks. It wasn't random. It was precise. Someone had deliberately picked through my garden like it was their private grocery aisle. And in that moment, I stopped doubting what I already knew deep down. It was Patricia. Who else would be so bold, so entitled? Who else would look me in the eye and comment on my tomatoes one day, then walk into my backyard the next and steal them without a hint of guilt? I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. I truly did. But this wasn't the first theft. It wasn't even the second. This was a pattern. A silent game of dominance. She was daring me to challenge her, to confront the untouchable HOA president who always seemed to float above consequences. But I wasn't interested in confrontation. I was interested in making it stop. And so I took steps, real, enforceable ones. I installed a sturdy new lock on my garden gate, reinforced the latch, posted a more formal sign, a laminated sheet of the actual HOA gardening guidelines highlighted with the relevant sections. I even added a second, smaller placard. Private property, please respect the space. It wasn't aggressive, it was polite, legal, and I hoped it would be enough to remind her that what she was doing wasn't just annoying, it was theft, real theft. But Patricia didn't back down. She changed tactics. The very next week, I started receiving official HOA violation notices in my mailbox. Not one, not two, but 5, each more absurd than the last. One claimed my irrigation system was too visible from the walking path. Another insisted my raised beds exceeded the allowed height by ½ an inch. One even cited unauthorized varietal display, as if planting exotic strawberries was somehow a violation of suburban law. At first I laughed, but that laughter faded quickly as I realized what was really happening. This wasn't about gardening, it was retaliation. Patricia couldn't steal anymore, so she was weaponizing bureaucracy to make my life miserable. Every violation required a formal response, a written explanation. In some cases, a physical appearance before the HOA board. I found myself printing out receipts for irrigation parts, water conservation approvals from the county, and plant height certifications I never imagined I'd need. And at every board meeting, there she was, sitting at the center of the long folding table, clipboard in hand, her mouth curved into that smug half smile that said, "I own this place." She didn't speak often, but she didn't need to. Her silence was a performance, carefully calculated to make it clear that she was both the judge and the executioner. Each time I defended myself, presented evidence, quoted the bylaws she once twisted against me, I watched her expression shift ever so slightly, disappointment giving way to irritation, irritation curdling into something darker. She wanted me to snap. She wanted me to get angry, to yell, to give her an excuse to file a formal complaint and paint me as the unstable neighbor. But I didn't. I remained calm, composed, measured. Every word I spoke came from the rulebook she clutched so tightly to her chest, and that, I think, infuriated her more than anything else. But nothing prepared me for what happened in late August. It had been a brutally hot week, so I left town for a weekend to visit my parents. I'd made sure everything in the garden was stable, drip systems set, sunshades in place, and the new lock on the gate holding firm. I came back Sunday evening, tired but looking forward to checking on my pepper plants. I had been cultivating a rare mix for months, preparing for a small batch hot sauce competition. Chocolate butlers, death spirals, and the most anticipated of all, the Carolina Reapers. These weren't your average garden variety peppers. They were fire incarnate, meant for cooking with gloves, face protection, and serious respect. I had cared for them like prized possessions, but when I stepped into the garden, my stomach dropped. The lock was gone, cut clean through. Several plants had been stripped, especially the ones bearing the ripest reapers. Someone had come in with tools, intent, and zero fear of consequences. The rage that built up inside me wasn't loud. It was quiet, cold, and razor-sharp. This wasn't casual garden raiding anymore. This was targeted, coordinated. Someone had destroyed property, ignored clearly posted warnings, and stolen something that could cause real harm if mishandled. And the only person who had motive, history, and the arrogance to do such a thing was Patricia. She had crossed a line, and it was time she realized that some plants bite back. That night, I stayed up thinking. I paced the kitchen, replaying her smug expressions, her false pleasantries, her dismissive tone as she accused me of violating rules she never followed herself. I wasn't going to call the police, not yet, but I wasn't going to let her keep treating my garden like her personal farmer's market either. I had something she wanted, something she couldn't resist, and if she insisted on taking what wasn't hers, then she would have to face the consequences. The next morning, just before sunrise, I put on gloves and harvested every ripe Carolina Reaper and ghost pepper I had left. Their glossy red skins glowed in the light like polished rubies, beautiful but deadly. I positioned them carefully in my garden beds, placing them where my heirloom tomatoes usually grew. I arranged them for maximum visibility, maximum temptation. They looked innocent enough to the untrained eye, like oversized cherry tomatoes or ornamental sweet peppers. I added a single laminated sign, tucked discreetly into the soil. Caution, extremely hot peppers, not for consumption. It wasn't flashy, just clear, fair warning for anyone who bothered to read. Then I waited. Not with hope, not with fear, just with a simmering sense of justice. Patricia had wanted a battle. Now she would see that even the most polite gardeners have a breaking point, and sometimes the sweetest fruit hides the fiercest fire. The next 24 hours stretched like molasses, slow and thick with anticipation. I went about my day with a strange mix of simmering adrenaline and quiet satisfaction. On the surface, everything was normal. I watered the lawn, paid a few bills, took the trash out. But underneath I was bracing for a storm I'd carefully summoned. I had no doubt Patricia would come. The peppers were too perfectly ripe, too visually irresistible, and her ego too inflated to imagine she'd been outmaneuvered. She thought herself untouchable, unaccountable, always the one pulling strings behind the scenes. And in her mind, my garden had always been just another asset to quietly exploit. But today the game was different. She didn't know the rules had changed. At exactly 7:17 the next morning, right on schedule, like a well-rehearsed performance, Patricia appeared. Same pastel pantsuit. Today's was a buttercup yellow that practically glowed in the early light. Same pristine gardening gloves, same air of entitlement that seemed to part the air around her like royalty through a crowd. She approached my garden gate with a quick glance around, her eyes scanning the neighborhood like a child about to sneak a cookie from the jar, thinking no one saw her, believing she was alone again. She reached into her oversized handbag, pulled out a sleek pair of garden shears, and without a hint of hesitation, clipped straight through the lock I'd just replaced. No subtlety, no shame, just a smooth, practiced motion, like she'd done it a dozen times before. The gate creaked open, and she slipped inside, her eyes locking immediately on the vibrant red fruit waiting in my garden beds. I watched from a distance as she knelt gracefully, basket in one hand, shears in the other, reaching for the largest Carolina Reapers. Her expression didn't show guilt. It showed satisfaction. She was smiling. She believed, genuinely believed, that this was her reward, her due, that the world owed her these small stolen victories because she ran a newsletter and chaired an HOA. She moved with precision, selecting the ripest fruits, avoiding ones with blemishes or signs of early rot. To any outsider, she would have looked like a seasoned gardener proudly collecting her harvest. Only she wasn't harvesting. She was stealing. Again. She added a few ghost peppers to the basket, their pale orange skins practically glowing like lanterns in the morning light. To the untrained eye, they were beautiful, exotic, harmless. But I knew better. Each one was a ticking time bomb of heat, packed with capsaicin levels high enough to bring grown men to their knees. It didn't matter. Patricia didn't read labels. She saw what she wanted and took it. As she turned to leave, she paused at the garden gate, gave the area one last casual glance, and exited as if nothing unusual had happened. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I simply watched her disappear down the path, her basket swinging gently by her side, filled with doom disguised as produce. That evening, the fallout came faster than I expected. I hadn't even finished dinner when I noticed something unusual in my mailbox. 3 envelopes. The first was printed with the HOA's official letterhead announcing an emergency board meeting scheduled for the next day. The second was a formal complaint addressed directly to me, accusing me of cultivating dangerous biological materials with intent to harm. And the third was handwritten in a hurried scrawl, Patricia's husband. He was asking, begging, really, for clarification about the tomatoes his wife had eaten. Apparently, she had blended several of the Reapers into her breakfast smoothie, assuming they were some exotic variety of cherry tomato or sweet pepper. What followed, according to a particularly chatty neighbor, was something out of a horror movie. The scream that erupted from Patricia's kitchen that morning sent birds flying from rooftops and prompted her neighbor to call emergency services, thinking a violent crime was in progress. By the time paramedics arrived, Patricia had consumed nearly a gallon of milk in desperation, mascara streaking down her face, sweat pouring from her brow, her hands trembling so violently she'd shattered a drinking glass on the tile floor. She was incoherent, rocking in a chair surrounded by a battlefield of empty cartons and discarded cold compresses. The EMTs initially thought she was having an allergic reaction until the husband explained what she'd ingested. The report they filed noted extreme oral burning, disorientation, and panic due to high capsaicin intake. In layman's terms, she ate the world's hottest pepper and paid the price. It should have ended there. But Patricia wasn't the kind to bow out gracefully. She doubled down. At the emergency HOA meeting, she showed up, looking like she'd walked through a wind tunnel, red-rimmed eyes, visibly chapped lips, and a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck like a wounded aristocrat. But she still wore a pantsuit, light lavender this time, power dressing for the illusion of control. She sat at the head of the table, flanked by board members who wore equally stunned expressions as she launched into a speech accusing me of endangering the community. She called my peppers chemical weapons, claimed I had planted them with malicious intent, and even suggested I'd violated local agriculture safety codes by growing hostile flora. It was so absurd I almost laughed, almost. When it was my turn to respond, I kept it simple. I laid out the facts. Seed receipts showing I'd been growing these peppers long before the conflict began, printouts of state gardening regulations, highlighted sections of the HOA rulebook permitting the cultivation of any legal plants within a fenced backyard. Most importantly, I brought photos of the warning sign I'd posted, clearly visible, clearly labeled, and placed days before the incident. What truly shifted the tone in the room, though, was the hard proof of her repeated trespassing, theft, and property damage. Expressions around the table changed. Discomfort gave way to disbelief, then to indignation. Even her staunchest ally, the treasurer, avoided eye contact. Patricia's face went from flushed red to pale, her fingers tapping nervously on her clipboard as if she could somehow edit reality with enough noise. Her husband, who had remained silent until that point, finally spoke, his voice strained and laced with barely concealed rage. "These Peppers sent my wife to the emergency room," he snapped. "This was reckless. You should be ashamed." I turned to him, calm but pointed. What's reckless is someone stealing produce from a private garden despite a clear warning. What's dangerous isn't the plant, it's the entitlement. A few board members nodded subtly. The vice president, a retired judge known for his no-nonsense demeanor, cleared his throat and looked around the table. "We've heard enough. Patricia, in light of this evidence, I move for your immediate suspension as HOA president pending a full member vote." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia stared at him, mouth open, too stunned to speak. When she finally found her voice, it was brittle, cracking with disbelief. "You can't be serious. Over Peppers, over a misunderstanding." But her words fell on stone. "This isn't about Peppers," the VP replied. "It's about trespassing, theft, and abuse of power." He turned to me with a slight nod. "Mr. Christopher, on behalf of the board, we owe you an apology. Your violation notices will be reviewed and likely dismissed. We thank you for your patience." Patricia's composure collapsed. She stammered, tried to regain footing, papers fluttering from her clipboard as she stood up in a rush. "This isn't over," she muttered, her voice trembling with fury and humiliation. Her husband placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her away before she could do more damage. As they walked out of the meeting room, heads lowered, shoulders tense, the rest of the board remained seated, watching them go. And for the first time in months, the air around me felt still, settled, like something poisonous had finally been pulled from the soil. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in Sycamore Heights shifted in ways both subtle and seismic. The invisible tension that had coiled through the neighborhood like an underground wire began to unravel inch by inch. People who once kept their heads down during HOA meetings suddenly had a little more spring in their step during morning dog walks. Conversations that used to stop abruptly whenever Patricia turned the corner now flowed freely on front porches and cul-de-sacs. It was as if someone had opened a window and let in a long, overdue breeze. Of course, there was no announcement, no parade, no official newsletter declaring the end of her reign. But everyone knew. The pastel matriarch of the rulebook had been dethroned, and the kingmaker, ironically, had been a tomato-loving gardener with a pepper harvest too hot to handle. Patricia didn't show her face for a while after the board meeting. No mid-morning strolls, no clipboard checkups, no unsolicited reminders about fence heights or acceptable mulch colors. Her home, once the nerve center of neighborhood enforcement, became unusually quiet. The blinds remained drawn. The flags once switched out with military precision for every minor holiday now stayed limp and forgotten. Rumors floated through the grapevine like pollen, that she was considering a lawsuit, that she had contacted her nephew who was a lawyer, though no one ever confirmed whether this mysterious nephew actually existed. Someone even claimed she'd tried to schedule a second emergency meeting to correct the injustice of her removal, but the board refused to entertain it. And so, for the first time in years, Patricia Wilkerson found herself not only stripped of power, but ignored, and that, more than anything, was the punishment she could never forgive. I went back to my garden with a strange new feeling, freedom. Not the basic kind of freedom you feel when the weather's nice and the chores are done. This was something deeper, richer. The freedom to exist in your own space without someone constantly looking over your fence, nitpicking every leaf and branch. I found myself lingering longer among the raised beds, running my fingers along the sturdy vines, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves like stained glass. The peppers glowed with a kind of defiant pride now. The tomatoes, plump and dark as rubies, seemed to pulse with quiet triumph. Every fruit that ripened felt like a tiny, sweet victory. And then something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors who had once kept their distance, too wary of getting caught in Patricia's crosshairs, started dropping by. First, it was Lisa from 2 doors down, bringing over a cutting from her lavender bush and asking if I could trade for some basil. Then it was Mark, a retired firefighter who lived across the street, offering to help reinforce the garden fence just in case Patricia decided to make a dramatic return. Even the Anderson kids, who usually treated the neighborhood like their personal racetrack, started asking questions about planting watermelon. People smiled more, waved more, shared more. It was like the neighborhood had come alive again after holding its breath for too long. At the next official HOA meeting, held a week later with Patricia notably absent, the board formally voted to remove her from the presidency. The decision was unanimous. Even her previous allies on the board didn't speak in her defense. The vice president, now serving as acting chair, made a point of clarifying new procedural rules around property access, transparency, and conflict resolution. It was the kind of meeting that didn't feel like a trial or a lecture, but a reset, a new beginning. And when the floor was opened for public comment, something unexpected happened. People applauded, not for drama, not for revenge, but for the simple return of fairness. And for once, I didn't feel like the neighborhood outcast or the guy obsessed with peppers. I felt like part of something, like maybe my little stand for garden justice had rippled out wider than I ever intended. Patricia, for all her bluster, never apologized, but she also never challenged the vote. Perhaps deep down, she understood that there was no coming back from that smoothie incident. You can harass, manipulate, and bully people for years, but nothing quite cancels your authority, like screaming bloody murder over a misidentified ghost pepper while surrounded by empty milk cartons. The story had already become legend. People retold it at block parties, barbecues, and book clubs with ever-increasing flair. Some versions added fire trucks, others claimed she tried to sue a grocery store out of confusion. But the truth, strange and poetic as it was, needed no embellishment. Patricia, the mighty enforcer of Sycamore Heights, had been brought down by her own arrogance and a pepper known to induce hallucinations. Summer turned into fall. The garden slowed, easing into the rhythm of shorter days and cooler nights. I planted winter greens, added some decorative cabbages, and gave the soil a chance to rest. But the peace, the genuine peace, remained. I had worried that winning would come with backlash, that someone else might rise to fill Patricia's shoes, or that I'd be labelled a troublemaker. But instead, what came was balance, quiet respect, even a few thank yous whispered over mailboxes and fences. One morning, I found a note in my mailbox. No name, just a folded piece of stationery tucked into an envelope with a single pepper seed taped inside. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Thank you for standing your ground. Maybe now we can all grow something worth sharing. I never found out who sent it. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe that was the whole point. I didn't start this wanting a fight. I just wanted to grow something beautiful. But sometimes, in order to protect the quiet, nourishing things we love, we have to stand firm. We have to weed out the ones who think their power is more important than our peace. And sometimes, just sometimes, all it takes to bring down a tyrant is a little heat and the courage to plant it.